Hey there. How's it going today, folks? Thanks for attending my SSE lecture today. I think it's been a couple of years since I gave a presentation to the SSE group. And today, what I want to do is focus on some possible ideas of what makes remote viewing work. How is it possible? How do you actually have non-electromagnetic communications and interactions at a distance in a way that defies conventional Maxwellian electrodynamics. Um, my background, as some of you know, is actually as a sociologist. I'm a former statistics teacher and research methods teacher in sociology. So the ideas I'm going to present to you today are kind of a layman's interpretation of some of these ideas in physics. It's what you might pick up also if you are a non physicist or non engineer reading these ideas, and that's about the depth of it. So if you have any comments or ideas or other ways to interpret what I'm saying here, we can address that in the Q&A. So we're going to talk about the Aharonov-Bohm effect, phase singularities in the cerebral cortex, and how this may enable remote viewing to actually work. Now, RV is something I got involved with at Courtney Brown's Farsight Institute back in 1996. I had just heard him talking on my local community radio station, and got his book, just sort of was curious about it, went and took the course, and I found that, like many of you, that there were some real results there, even with a couple days of training, even before the full 8-day class had finished. There were definitely correlations there, which to me, as a former statistics teacher, showed me that there is definitely a subterranean sort of signal transfer going on that was not apparent how it worked, how it happened, and you're all familiar with the history of the RV program um, and the results that it can achieve, which we'll look at the very end. But I've always been wondering ever since 1996, how is it possible? How does it work? Um, what's the mechanisms behind this sort of non-local perception, communication, and even interaction? So let's take a look at how this may be possible. Um, so we know some of my background here. So we're going to talk about geometry and shapes, and geometry is sort of the basis for the Aharonov Bohm effect. And even if we look around in nature, we know that there are certain shapes that nature prefers, sort of phi ratio shape, which we often find built into nature, and we see it in this drawing from Leonardo da Vinci, where he built the golden section, sort of this idea of the perfect proportion of the human body. So what we have to ask here is this sort of some sort of random artifact of our particular reality, the golden section 1 to 1.618, or is there some deeper meaning to that particular mathematical expression? Does it have a significance more than just physical beauty, the way Leonardo da Vinci was looking at it? We find this golden section all sorts of places in our inner ear, in the spirals, in our heart valves, in the ratio of our bone structures, 1.6 to 1 throughout our entire body, and just all sorts of measurements. You're going to find it over and over again. We see this in galaxies, and it's often portrayed in uh, Eastern healing arts. Tai Chi, Qigong makes a big deal of these types of spirals. And do they signify anything deeper? We know that RV does have, just from the existing research, Ed May and others who presented research about sidereal time, and how there's sort of a correlation between where the Earth is in position to the Milky Way. Uh, Apparently, according to the data that's been presented by Ed May and others, when the Earth is at a certain sidereal time pointed in towards the center of the Milky Way, it has the effect of lowering RV ability to some degree versus when you're on the other side of the Earth facing away from the center of the Milky Way, as if there's some sort of radiation coming from the center of our galaxy. So, this is sort of one effect that we've known about for a while, where there's an effect of cosmological impact on human perceptual ability in RV. And here's the graph about sidereal time. So RV seems to be better apparently at 1300 sidereal time and a lower ability at around 1800 sidereal time. This is not something I've experimented with personally. I'm just going based on previous SSE and IRVA lectures. But there's also other components of cosmology that relate to biological, chemical, and nuclear effects. And this largely comes out of the work of Alexander Parkhomov, a Russian nuclear physicist who worked in a lot of classified Soviet programs, aeronautics, and after the fall of the Soviet Union, built using spare Soviet equipment an ultra low energy neutrino detector. And he was able to find lots of correlations between neutrino flows. These are relic neutrinos from the cosmological background radiation. These are not the solar neutrinos that we've heard about that are fast and very small and seldom interact with us. These are the opposite. These are micron to millimeter sized neutral particles that interact with cells and molecules and so forth. And he found these correlations where the relic neutrinos actually have an impact over the course of a year, the repeatable patterns in nuclear atomic decay, fruit flies, growth, chemical reactions, where you normally would not expect a sort of a cosmological effect. So it's sort of similar to sidereal time, again, finding a sort of a cosmological factor. And there's been a lot of speculation that these relic neutrinos, which don't interact with us energetically, but they kind of interact with us gravitationally, that this is one component of dark matter. A very small part of dark matter, maybe 1 to 2%, but the measurements of these relic neutrinos line up with what we know about dark matter. And um, several people, including Boyd Bushman, a former scientist at Lockheed, have argued that this relic neutrino dark matter interaction is much more important than has been thought of so far. And it's actually maybe where a lot of the action is in the so-called relic neutrinos and their counterparts from the human body, cold neutrinos, which have the same mass as relic neutrinos, but they're emitted by biological organisms. So this is just something to keep in mind as a possible subject matter for further exploration. And why would we want to look at this? It's because relic neutrinos seem to have a bosonic effect on matter. They seem to act like a catalytic effect. They have a catalytic effect on energetic reactions. Even though they don't contribute energy directly, they seem to catalytically cause events to speed up and occur more rapidly than in their absence. They're also a source of coherent matter through something called inverse beta decay, where these relic neutrinos, the cold neutrinos, when they're emitted in the inverse beta decay process, have the same temperature, same frequency, and we'll see why that's important in a moment. So when we look at some of the people who've done RV, And the reason this connects back to something like relic neutrinos, cold neutrinos, is a lot of the people that have psi ability also have PK ability. And as you'll know from Hal Puthoff's presentations here at SSE, IRVA in the past, and also Russ Targ, that one of the first experiments they did with Ingo was to have him affect a magnetometer at Stanford that graduate students use. You've heard about this experiment where Hal asked him to put his mind on the magnetometer, and according to Hal, 3 times in a row, every time that Ingo was imagining perceiving this magnetometer that's buried in the ground under concrete. I mean, it's something we're told is so stable that nothing would affect it, not planes overhead, trucks on the road. I mean, it's there for super stable scientific experiments, but every time Ingo was able to put his mind on it, we saw, according to the graphs that Hal showed us, there was this fluctuation that should not have happened in this magnetometer buried a couple feet under the ground in concrete. And so that was Ingo's first interaction, as far as I know, with Russ and Hal over at SRI. It wasn't actually a remote viewing experiment; it was a PK experiment. And this is true of other people that we know have been very good at doing RV. If you've seen the documentary Lance Mungia's Third Eye Spies, before even Ingo was tested at SRI, we had Uri Geller. And Uri, if you watch the movie, you'll see he's doing great RV exercises. Back then, this is before coordinates, before CRV. This is looking at things in boxes. You can see him do 9 or 10 out of 10 correct in a row. But Uri is also capable of performing PK experiments, PK effects. So it's another example of how RV and PK go together. Again, suggesting a kind of physical aspect to RV, not something that's purely conceptual, but has some sort of physical correlates, because people that can do RV also are able to bend things, affect things with their mind in a physical way. One more person, Nina Kalikina, the Soviet psychic PK practitioner, and there are some good YouTube videos of her performing her PK experiments, showing this in front of large groups of Soviet scientists, moving things around in glass boxes and so forth. And she's another person that seemed to be able to be really good on a kind of a spectrum of psychic activities, not just one component of it. RV, I think the way some of us here in the U.S. have learned it, it's sort of one skill. I mean, there have been spoon bending parties and stuff at the IRVA conferences, but it's sort of presented as something that is sort of distinct. But if you look at the larger evidence, it doesn't seem distinct from PK. Now, interestingly enough, more physical aspects of this is Nina would say that she would be affected by thunderstorms. If there were thunderstorms present, her PK ability wasn't as good. It would go down. She'd be physically exhausted from doing these PK exercises. Her respiration rate would go up and so forth. So there's physical correlates with this PKs. If some sort of energy is actually being exchanged, it's not just purely a mental effort. Of course, we've had Pear Labs, Brenda Dunn and Bob John, who also, in the presentations they gave us over the years, we heard about the RV experiment and micro PK. And you've all seen this graph before. If you haven't, it showed the cumulative effects of the Paralab results over 120,000 trials over 20 years, for a total of 375,000 trials total. And the net effect was like affecting 2 to 3 events per 10,000 in the random number generator In other words, where you'd expect a random event, a one or a zero, two to three out of those events would no longer be random if you had a person attempting to affect the micro PK generator process. So the odds against chance are huge, 375 trillion to 1, that this is purely a random effect, uh, that there's no effect going on here. So this is more evidence that there's an association between PK and RV. And I've actually seen demonstrations of this myself, because when I went to Japan to teach RV for a publishing company, starting around 2005, um, I was taken to this place called the Magic Parlor north of Nagasaki, where the practitioner did a series of RV and PK demonstrations, which were quite startling. Uh, Bending, twisting glass into like a liquid-like form, as you can see some examples here of this Pepsi bottle and so forth, which he demonstrated right in front of us, uh, seeing the kind of glass liquefy in his hands, and bending spoons. And I saw him twice. One time, the person introduced me to him, a surgeon, a Japanese surgeon who was taking my RV class, uh, introduced me, and this practitioner ran his hand over my arm at a distance, and it felt like pins and needles in the bone. I mean, way deep in there. So it was like some sort of energy is definitely being radiated from this particular practitioner. He was able to move the hands on my watch without touching the crown. And if we look at some of uh, the ideas that came out of the SRI program, Hal Puthoff in particular, when he stopped being one of the co-directors of the RV program um, at SRI, went on to, and these are some pictures of Pat Bryce, and there's Kit Green along with Russ and Hal. Um, he proceeded to uh, apply for patents in this so-called Aharonov-Bohm effect. And what the Aharonov-Bohm effect is, it's a type of communication or interaction between a particle and a completely enclosed solenoid, uh, a magnetic field that is completely uh, reduced to zero from shielding. And yet, the particle, if it moves around this solenoid in a slow adiabatic process, it will adapt, it will adopt some of the phase of that particular magnetic field, even in a complete absence of any uh, vector energy. And here are two patents that Hal applied for communication, specifically with aspects to communications with submarines, in the complete absence of EM fields. And so you would sort of think that if Hal created these patents just out of the RV program, it's probably because he was thinking all along when he was working with uh, Ingo and Pat and the other psychics that were there, that he's probably wondering what the effect is, and he probably thinks, like some of us, that it has to do with this AB effect. The AB effect, Aharonov-Bohm, it has a very interesting history. It's discovered before the 1950s by Side and Ehrenberg. And these two engineers didn't realize what they had discovered, so they just kind of let it go. And it's rediscovered by Yakir Aharonov. And he finally convinces David Bohm in the UK to let him study this effect, because his thesis supervisors in Israel said this is not going to go anywhere. But the AB effect is considered to be one of the strangest quantum effects there is. Again, in the complete absence of any electromagnetic field, you're still going to have an interaction between a photon and a solenoid, a completely shielded solenoid. And normally, when we think about math, we apply it to things in the real world that we can physically measure, that we agree are physically real. In the case of the AB effect, we're applying mathematics to imaginary processes, so called vector potential. And even though it's purely a mathematical exercise in the vector math, it still ends up having a physical effect. So it's an example where imaginary numbers have real physical effects, and it's not something that was actually uh, accepted for a long time. I mean, Aronhoff and Bohm proposed this in the 50s, and it's not experimentally verified until 1986 by Tonemura in Japan. And here it is. You can see a particle comes in the vicinity of a completely shielded solenoid. So if you had a tri-field meter and you put it next to this solenoid, you're going to have zero readings. There is not going to be any magnetic or electrical activity on your EM meter, your tri-field meter, but the particle is going to register a phase change consistent with the energy in the solenoid, even though there's nothing in the field. So we're talking about non-radiating EM fields that are still communicating information. And this is why you can see it relates to possibly to RV. If you'd like to hear more about this from Eric Weinstein and how in Jesse Michaels, you can look at the physics of UFOs, of course, and they go into these sort of non-ordinary EM fields. Howland specifically talks about these toroidal types of fields, toroidal moments, which come uh, out of the work of Zeldovich in the Soviet Union, Yakir Zeldovich in the 50s and Dubovik in the 60s, who proposed sort of extensions of ordinary Maxwellian fields, so called toroidal moments, non radiating toroidal moments. Just think of something like a focused donut, and you're thinking of a toroidal sort of shape where you have these wrappings along these so-called poloidal wrappings of energy around the donut shape. And so it's a non-ordinary type of shape that completely can shield any of the EM energy from radiating out in an ordinary way. And it creates all sorts of alternative processes. And you can watch this video if you want to hear them talking about how this relates to the physics of UFOs and all sorts of extraordinary phenomena. Even James Clerk Maxwell himself imagined these sort of vortex fields uh, in a sort of idea about how the ether could be structured. He had this sort of toroidal sense with electrical positive and negative electrical charges. So this even goes back to Maxwell. And even before Maxwell, you had the work of Wilhelm Weber and Carl Friedrich Gauss a couple decades before, where they're talking about these sort of non-ordinary effects, even purely from a Newtonian perspective, from Newton's third law. They were able to speculate that you would have a negative inertial mass and all sorts of uh, kind of counterintuitive effects that we now associate with UFOs and UAP. Uh, Alcubierre warp drives and so forth. This all even precedes Maxwellian electrodynamics in the work of Wilhelm Weber. If you look into that, you'll see they're talking about these sort of inverse reciprocal uh, effects that we now consider to be indicative of these toroidal moments. So we're talking about kind of an alternative type of resonance where two objects, processes can interact at a distance without anything happening in the field in between. A sort of a non-local EM effect, not due to radiation, but due to a type of resonant interaction. And this actually was recognized recently in this patent from Lockheed Martin, systems and methods for generating coherent matter wave beams, where they argue that they can create the same effects seen in a Bose-Einstein condensate, but at room temperature and with any particles they choose. And they have a little diagram here you can see on the right with these coupled resonant cavities, where they say through, if you read the abstract here, through vector potential, not the actual vector field, but the vector potential, they can create this sort of local interaction at a distance, for cloaking, invisibility, directed energy weapons, communications, and so forth. So this idea of something just like vector potential, the complete absence of any measurable field, has now been, accepted as something that's real for creating non-local communication. So this may be one way that RV could actually work. Even John Archibald Wheeler at Princeton, the thesis supervisor of many great physicists, including Hugh Everett III, who I've talked about in my previous SSE lectures, in his idea of the so-called many worlds idea. Wheeler kind of came up with this sort of toroidal shape. He called it a geon, a geomagnetic entity, something. He speculated that it would create a gravitational field, a little like Boyd Bushman in that earlier slide where he's talking about neutrinos interacting with these toroidal shapes, dark matter. Even in the 50s, Wheeler's proposing a type of gravitational technology here using these self-similar repeating toroidal shapes. We know from the work of KGB science experiments in the 80s, and this comes from the work of Zverblis and Nevesky. Zverblis being a scientist that was invited to see a toroidal type wired shape that he said in a Moscow basement was capable of creating invisible ball lightning. You could remove the device and the charge would be there for several days over the surface of the desk that you could measure with, even after the machinery had been turned off. These sort of interlooping toroidal shapes. He called it a bagel. Again, kind of like a toroidal shape, but it's kind of loops around loops around loops, as you can see from this diagram. And this is just the same sort of Maxwellian alternating electric and magnetic fields at right angles, but these are closed electromagnetic fields that do not radiate outward, as opposed to the ordinary open electromagnetic fields which we're used to, which create radio waves and open EM type wave sources that radiate outward. These are non-radiating, they're closed inward, and Zverblis and Nevesky believed that this radiated all the way down to the quantum vacuum field and focused the photons, kept compressing the energy, and was responsible for generating a ball lightning, either visible ball lightning or invisible ball lightning, based on a sort of fractal repeating pattern. So these toroidal moments seem to be very important, and I'm basing this sort of on the work of Bob Greenyer and the work of the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project. Martin Fleischmann being one of the co-inventors with Stanley Pons of one sort of method of creating what was called back in the in the 80s cold fusion. It's more nowadays it's more considered to be low energy nuclear reaction, not literally cold fusion, but there's this tradition all the way from Zeldovich to Dubovik to Nevesky, Zverblisk, these closed pointing vectors, concentration of photons, as you can see from the diagram, just repeating magnetic and electrical loops, getting smaller and smaller and smaller, all the way to David Freiberger at Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, funded by DOE, as this is the basis for ball lightning, vacuum currents, and all of the types of phenomena associated with ball lightning, micro ball lightning, and so forth. Now, this is where it sort of gets interesting because these particular patterns exist in different forms in nature, these toroidal shapes. And it even seems uh, that one more thing before we get to how it actually works in our brain, is that there are different ways of creating these toroidal shapes. Um, you can use Mobius strips, the way Shekparanov did. Uh, it's sort of an alternative form to create this sort of pattern. And then in biological organisms, Raybould was able to show that these toroidal uh, patterns exist in the brains of fruit flies, which allows them to detect magnetic fields and use this as a type of navigation. Uh, you can see here, I mean, it sounds like they're just using it for navigation, but look what he's talking about. Anapole excitations, that's from Zeldovich, candidates for dark matter, structured donuts, and so forth. So these toroidal moments have a lot of implications for a lot of different aspects of physics phenomena that we have a lot of questions about. But who would have thought that the M.C. Escher drawings are actually the basis for this sort of self-enclosed, non-radiating EM fields? We know that this creates ball lightning in different forms, white ball lightning and invisible black ball lightning from these toroidal shapes and these Mobius strip forms. Ken Shoulders, who worked with Hal Puthoff, has talked extensively about the significance of these types of charge clusters and connection to dark matter, alternative types of matter, and so forth. Now, in the human brain, which is really what the point of this lecture is about, is there was some research that came up about a year ago where they found these sort of spiraling vortex patterns in the human brain. There's this article, Vortex of the Cortex, which is that even in our own biology, you have these patterns that are going to negate ordinary EM fields and allow for the presence of the Aronoff-Bohm effect. Well, once you have these toroidal shapes that neutralize existing EM fields, it's replaced by the AB effect. And this would be sort of one possible subject for future research is, do we find this in remote viewers? We find these spiraling sorts of patterns it's on the surface of the cortex? Does this have anything to do with RV or not? It's just a really good question because the signals have been seen there. And so just like we saw in the first slide here, Leonardo da Vinci, we know that some of these patterns and ratios exist in biological organisms. Is it there for purpose? Does it actually serve a function? So this is something that really deserves further investigation, whether these spiral brainwave patterns, not just related to cognitive processing, the way some scientists have looked at it, is this actually the basis for RV, the basis for the creation of the AB effect, and so forth? Um, in the human brain. So you can take a look at this research yourself, but it suggests again that these sort of vortex-like patterns that we see, according to Shoulders, in ball lightning, in charge clusters, all those Soviet and Russian scientists we looked at, Shekparanov and others, that spiral-like pattern has a very interesting electromagnetic effect to cancel ordinary Maxwellian EM fields and to create kind of an extension, sort of what's called a multipole extension of uh, EM fields into a non-radiating boundary and a non-local effect. That's really the thesis here. And so, um, again, much like vortices act in turbulence, spirals engage in intricate interactions, organizing brain's complex activity. Now, if you've done RV, you know it's not completely a brain-related phenomenon. It's something you feel in your body. But again, it just raises a lot of interesting questions whether this is related to RV. Uh, is this what we're doing when we do RV? Are we canceling out these ordinary EM fields and hooking into something else? And for those of you who haven't seen just how accurate RV can be, it's just always astounding when you see this in classes that you're teaching. I've been teaching it since '96. Set up my own institute in Boulder, Mount Baldy Institute, since '97. I mean, we've seen this in people from the SRI program, whether it's Pat Price or Joe McMonagle, just incredibly accurate reproductions of a distant location or target. And you always can wonder, how is the viewer locking into that signal? Well, maybe this is one way that they're doing it. Here's the session that Joe McMonagle did, Lawrence Livermore Laboratories, if I'm not mistaken, and you see how accurate that building is there. But I mean, you see this in your own classes. I mean, I'm always astounded. Even total beginners can do something just that accurate in your RV class. So how do they do it? And look at this one of Area 51 at Groom Lake. You can see these MiG fighter planes in front of these hangar doors. I mean, this is a target I gave to one of viewers I was working with, and she was 500 miles away in Salt Lake City. I just said, Terry, would you like to do a session? I said, yes, here are the coordinates, and then this comes out of my fax machine. About an hour later, I mean, look, there's the hangar doors and the planes. It's completely picture perfect, accurate. Hangar doors and planes, hangar doors and planes. Any case, so this may be one way that RV actually works through this very interesting AB effect, which I think New Scientist said one of the top 7 mysterious and important quantum effects of all time. So, in conclusion, we would say, if this is true, this line of reasoning, that there is a quantum component to RV. It's not literally quantum entanglement. It's this other effect, this AB effect of non-local phase interaction uh, between interrelated sources that have this sort of connection through what's called vector potential. And again, it's purely in the math, but it's been verified to be real. And it seems to me that the sort of subtlety of the AB effect feels very close to what my experience is doing RV. So I could believe that it is the AB effect. Now, whether it is or not would take a little more experiments to show, but that's certainly, I think, a leading possibility now. So thanks. Any questions?